Welcome to the Brainwave. Today we're going to be talking about agriculture and land management. So we have three main goals for the day. We want to figure out what agriculture is, we're going to talk about cultivation and domestication, and then what are some theories of land management. So we talked about this the other day in our welcome meeting, but first off, what is agriculture? Basically, agriculture is the practice of deciding I have this plant, it provides me nutrients or goods or materials, raw materials I need. I'm going to practice growing this plant on my land and then harvest it to receive some kind of product or natural good. Okay, so this can be raising plants, this could be raising animals, this could be growing trees, whatever you need. So it's the goal here is to collect food, fiber, and other raw materials. So in our world currently, we live in what we call an industrialized monoculture system, but we're slowly transitioning into a precision agricultural system, which is basically an increase in the industrialized nature of the agricultural system, but in a more, well, obviously a more precise and more precise factors is what I'll say. But the precision of that really is dependent on the goal, and we'll talk about that more later in the semester. Now, for the next couple of minutes, we're going to look at the current state of agriculture in the United States and then across the globe. So in the United States, this is a map from the USDA basically showing all the agricultural regions of the US. And I want to point out a couple of trends here. So you'll notice that the majority of our agriculture is here in the Midwest. This is what we typically think of as the Corn Belt. This is the corn, our soy, our wheat, or the majority of those products. This is also called our breadbasket of the United States. We do have a couple of other specialized regions, like over here in California, the Central Valley of California. That is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. If you eat lettuce, if you eat strawberries, if you eat oranges, if you eat almonds, all of that, walnuts, all of that comes out of Central California and Southern California. Up here in Washington, you'll notice that the eastern part of the state is covered in a bunch of dots. That is primarily wheat. That's our small breadbasket. And then we also have a ton of tree fruit. Apples, cherries, pears, peaches, apricots, those kind of things are coming out of Washington. In Montana, you'll notice some grassland as well as some wheat and barley fields. Again, in Idaho, we have potato farms as well as onion fields. In Arizona, we have cotton and some onions up in the northern parts. Texas, we have quite a bit of agriculture. In the southeast, we have quite a bit of agriculture. In Pennsylvania and New York, we have a lot of tree fruit. So we can see a fairly good diversity of agriculture across the United States. The majority of our agricultural production, though, is based in the Midwest here. Now, when we zoom in on the great state of Kansas, what we see is a lot of blank space, which is kind of good news. I guess it means we have a lot of natural land, but you also see a ton of land under production. And we can see some clear patterns here. So out in western Kansas, we see a lot of this yellow and brown color. That's telling us about a specific crop. In central Kansas, you see a lot of green. Green is telling us about grassland or pasture. So grassland and pasture makes up the majority of our crops here in Kansas, over 2 million acres. Winter wheat, corn, soybean, those make about 1.5 million acres, and that's what we see out here in western Kansas primarily. Western Kansas also has a lot of feedlots. Feedlots are not considered in these statistics. Besides wheat, corn, and soybeans, we do have quite a bit of fallow land, and that's part of our crop rotation pattern, so that makes quite a bit of sense that we'd have a large portion of fallow land. After that, we have sorghum, deciduous forest, and open space or developed open space. So when we're talking about all of this from the United States and the Kansas perspective, what we're really getting at is that we have an entire system around the world and in the United States and even just in Kansas that revolves around agriculture. So an agricultural system is an assemblage of components that are formed into one unit to form some kind of interaction, okay? So basically an agricultural system are a bunch of parts that come together and unite to make something successful. So when we think of agricultural systems, we probably think of just farms typically. But in actuality, we have three main parts. We have the farm itself, we have the socio-technical side of the farm, and we have the socio-economic side of the farm. The farm is where the production is happening. The socio-technical side of the farm is like crop advisors, people who sell you fertilizers, those kind of people who come to do surveys or that work in the government. The socioeconomic side of things are the consumers. So they're the ones that are actually buying your products and consuming your food. Okay, so all of these have to work together to build a system that is capable of organizing itself, managing the land, protecting the crops, and just really building the business of agriculture. Now, in an agricultural system, we essentially have three primary levels. We have the personal farm systems. These are people that are primarily homesteading or growing for personal use. We have the village community farm systems, which is what we're hoping to build at Royal Valley. These are groups of farms that are working together to feed a certain number of people with a defined diet. And then we have the global agricultural system. And this is what the majority of our agriculture is focused on today. How can I feed as many people as possible in an industrialized fashion with the smallest amount of labor force and get the most out of the land in the shortest amount of time? So we're talking about systems. Well, let's look at the entire global agricultural system. So this is a diagram from a research paper, probably, and let's see, on the top left it says in 2009. So this is all the different parts of agriculture in the current world. And you see that this is a very complex machine and system that is working together and crossing over and talking to each other. Now, the key parts I want to point out here is that production is this central part right here, okay, in the middle. So in a way, production is kind of the heart of the food system, which makes sense because if we are producing food to feed people, the food is the key element that you need to be able to pass on to other parts of the system. On top of the food system, we have the politics and the governing system. So these are the people that make the rules and the regulations and manage us from the top down and determine how our food should be handled. On the right, we have food security initiatives, which are meant to protect the consumers over here on the socio-cultural side. Underneath our consumers, we have our value food chain, our food industries. These are things like grocery stores, processing facilities, those kind of people. So all of this comes together to create a global food system that is meant to increase food security while also increasing profitability for corporations. There's the good and the bad with this. You can definitely say that food, well, until recent years, food hasn't ever been as cheap as it was or as available as it was. Now, as we start to have issues related to reliance on fertilizers or cost of fertilizers and other inputs, that may change. The cost of food has risen about 20 to 30% with inflation and cost of goods since COVID-19. So we'll see how this updates and develops over time. Now, when we actually look at the U.S.'s industrial comparison by our total economic value, what we see over here on the left is that farms only make up a small portion of our total GDP, or total gross domestic product, for the entire United States, about maybe $150 million. Forestry makes up a really tiny part. Food, beverage, and tobacco manufacturing makes up a giant part, probably about $250 billion. Food and beverage stores, so like grocery stores or convenience stores, bodegas, whatever you want to think of it of, make up probably about $100 billion. And then food services like restaurants, bars, those kind of places make up a lot of money, about $300 billion worth of our economy. And when we look at it from an employment perspective, you'll notice that approximately 11.8 million jobs in the United States are food service related, so restaurants and bars and those things. Farms only make up 2.6 million jobs, so that's about 1.3% of the U.S. economy. In total, anything food related only makes up 10.5% of the U.S. economy. So food generally and agriculture specifically are a very small portion of the U.S. economy. A lot of countries, just farms alone will make up 10, 20, 30, 40% of the total employment for that country, and that has to do with economic development. So for example, somewhere like Cambodia or rural China or rural Africa, they don't really have access to industries. They're still considered developing countries or third world countries. So the majority of the population spends their time producing their own food, and that increases the percent of employment in the agricultural sectors. So there's good and bad things here. That basically says the U.S. is a rich country. We're an outlier as far as our economic status goes, but it also means that there's the potential that we are losing knowledge as far as developing the next generation of agriculturalists. Now, looking at this from an economic perspective, as far as how much does the average person spend on economic goods, or spend on how much does the average person spend on agricultural goods, what we see is that the majority of people's money goes towards housing. So housing makes up about 30% of your cost. About 16% goes to transportation to try to go make money. So right there, you're spending almost 50% of your money just trying to stay alive. On top of that, you have food at about 12%. So in total, you're looking at about 60% of your income goes to keeping a house over your head, or keeping a roof over your head, feeding yourself, and then transport, driving to your job to make money, to keep yourself fed and have water and those kind of things. And as far as when we look at the food and beverage manufacturing by industry, what we see is that meat makes up the majority of our employment by industry. So over 30% of food and beverage jobs in processing are directly related to meat processing. So meat is a major industry in the United States. Dairy is about 8%, fruit and veggies is about 9%, 8%, beverage is about 12%, bakeries are about 15%. Now, when we compare the United States statistics to the rest of the world, what we see is that our exports and our high value commodities have been increasing over time. So from 1994 to 2018, we've gone up from about $34 billion worth of exports to $99 billion worth of export. Part of that is inflation of the US dollar. The other part of it is growth in processed goods, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But what's really interesting is even though this number has quite literally tripled in the last 25, 30 years, we still are not number one in agriculture. We're actually number three in agriculture, behind China and I think Brazil right now. We're either number two or number three. And that's not a big deal. I mean, we're still doing great. You know, China has 1.3 billion people to try to feed, as well as a 1.3 billion person labor force. So they have a lot more people to do a lot more work than we do. We're about, what is it? So they have 1.3 billion people. We have 330 million people. So there's a massive difference in population size there. Now, when we look at what kind of goods are we sending out, we see over time we've been increasing the number of processed products that we're sending out. Our raw products have also increased, but not by much, and this is by total value. And then we see the semi-processed products are pretty flat. We do have a slight increase. So semi-processed products are things like fats, hides, feeds, fibers, flour, meals, oil, and sugar. Raw products are things like live animals, fresh fruits and veggies, nuts, and nursery products. Processed products are things like meat, milk, grain products, processed fruits and veggies, beverages, essential oils, and products of tropical commodities. What's interesting about this is we're exporting more processed products, but we're also importing more processed products. So a lot of our meat comes from one major company out of South America, primarily Brazil, and that company actually has a giant processing facility in Colorado. I think it's just north of Boulder, but this company sends a large portion of meat to major supermarket chains, and the reason for that is they can export the meat and process it, or grow it somewhere else and process it in South America and send it here cheaper on a frozen ship or a refrigerated and frozen ship than what they can actually produce it for here in the United States. So while we are increasing the amount of the exports that we have, we are also slightly starting to import more food too, based on just supply and demand, as well as the cost of goods in the United States. So why do I tell you this? I tell you this because in order for us to understand agriculture and to actually be able to talk about agri-science, we need to know where we're starting. So where we're starting is as an industrialized food system. What you and I have to do now for the rest of the semester is decide where we want to go. So now we're going to jump back in time and figure out where did this all start and how could we possibly move forward. So we need to talk about cultivation and domestication that led to the current state of our agricultural system. So, from what we know, just based on history and what we found in archaeological digs, we have about 10,000 years of agricultural history here. So we believe that agriculture started in the Mesopotamian region, which is like northeast Iraq, part of the Arabian Peninsula. And at the same time, we also have evidence that we had some early domestication of other goods in East Asia as well as in South America. But Mesopotamia gets the credit. And the first plants that we say we domesticated are wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. And the first animals we domesticated are goats and sheep. Now, in East Asia, they were domesticating rice, cotton, chicken, oxen, and horses. And in South America, we have evidence that they were domesticating potatoes, chicken, and either horses or like llamas and alpacas. So we've been herding those kind of animals for a very long time, primarily for a labor force and for pack animals. And then the question is, what were all these animals' purposes for us, or what was the purpose of all of these organisms? And really, what it comes down to is reducing human reliance and starting to build civilizations or communities. So, before we domesticated and cultivated, we lived in primarily hunter gatherer societies, which would have been nomadic. And when we move into this 10,000 year ago range, we start to set up communities and build cities and build towns and have technological advancement. And at that point, it doesn't make sense to move every day or every week to follow a herd of animals and to track your food. Instead, we can simply collect the seeds and select that food over time, or take the animal and guide them back to our community and watch that animal grow and then harvest that animal. So that's why we started to domesticate and cultivate. And over 10,000 years, we have advanced our foods up until this point. So currently, we say that we have about 300 species of plants that are fully domesticated. So that means that they are genetically different and totally their own thing in comparison to the wild species that they came from. And in actuality, we have about 2,500 species that we consider partially domesticated, but they aren't 100% a standalone species, or they're not 100% different than their wild species. And for the animals, we have about 40 species of animals that we say are fully domesticated. So some of these examples we talked about in the first week of school, but I'm going to give them to you again. So up here on the right, what you'll see is this is basically corn. So corn started as a plant called teosinte. Teosinte is a relative of grass. So corn, wheat, and rice are all relatives of grass. Basically what we did is took a piece of grass and then we artificially selected over time. So we said, oh, this piece of grass has bigger seed heads than the piece of grass over here. I am going to collect the seeds from the grass that has bigger seed heads and then grow it again next year. The next year you select the ones that are the biggest. The next year after that, maybe you select the ones that grow the fastest or produce fruit the earliest. Excuse me, not fruit. Produce seeds the earliest. Then you select the next one that's the biggest. And you do that for 10,000 years. So we might start with a product like teosinte over here on the left, where the seed head is the size of a quarter. And then we end up 10,000 years later with modern corn, where the seed head is about 7 times the size of a quarter. And it's producing less heads, but bigger heads and fewer leaves. And in general, the plant goes from about 3 feet tall to maybe now we could have corn in some light conditions that's 18 to 20 feet tall, and depending on what kind of corn it is. So what we're seeing here is basically that when we domesticate an organism, we have a large change in the characteristics based on what we are artificially selecting for. So in general, if we look at the picture on the bottom left here, our wild type is going to be what we would consider to be wild. It's going to have more fruit, and maybe it looks more bushy. It's just going to have totally different characteristics to something that has been domesticated. So it's going to start in a different form, and then as we artificially select for certain characteristics like bigger fruit, a lower number of fruit, larger leaves, a thicker stalk or stem, a taller plant, the characteristics of the plant change. And when the characteristics of the plant change, basically the programming inside of the plant changes, which alters the DNA of the plant or of the animal. And that is why we consider it domesticated, is because that is no longer a wild organism. That is an organism that has been artificially selected on for X number of years, in our case for 10,000 years. Now, another really good example of artificial selection is mustard. Mustard is a wild weed or a wild plant that is native in many areas of the world, and we get a lot of our vegetables from mustard. So this one plant has given rise to maybe 10 to 12 to 15 different types of cruciferous vegetables. That's what we call them, or foods that we eat. So broccoli is an example. Broccoli is a cousin of mustard. Cabbage comes from mustard. Kale comes from mustard. Cauliflower comes from mustard. So what we did over time is we took this mustard plant, we selected for different characteristics, and then we ended up getting a bunch of different types of vegetables from this one wild plant. All right, so this is where we kind of are. We're in this industrialized system. We have foods and animals that we've cultivated and artificially selected for certain characteristics over a 10,000 year time period. And now we manage them in what we call an industrialized monoculture system. But there are other types of agricultural systems that we could be working with. So our goal now is to explore these different ideas or concepts of land management. So when I think of land management, I think about stewarding the land. We're not really just here to say, yep, this is my piece of land, how can I make money on it? You are responsible for that land for the entire time that you own it or that you take care of it, and you need to be responsible stewards of your land. You need to think about every single aspect in the environment there. I know it's complicated, I know it's a lot to consider, but if you're not doing that, you're really not doing your job. And I really hope that you guys take that job seriously. So, the kind of agriculture that's most common around us is the monoculture. This is basically where you grow one type of crop on one field for a specific amount of time. So, we typically have a 3 or 4 crop rotation. Most people will do corn, wheat, soy, and then fallow or something of that variation. They might do 3 or 4 crop rotation and then let it sit fallow for a year for the soil to recover. They start over again. So that's what's most common in the United States and globally for people that are involved in a regular food system. And then there are other types of land management. So one of those is a polyculture. This is basically the simultaneous cultivation or exploitation of crops of a bunch of different kinds or animals of a bunch of different kinds. So if you look at this picture on the bottom right, this is an example of a polyculture. There's like 10 different types of crops here growing on one farm, and you see that there are much smaller areas of the crops. They're grown close together. In between the different types of the crops, you have basically like a barrier or a bush that separates the field, and so these could still be harvested pretty easily, but you have more diversity in the system. Then we also have silvopasture. This is basically integrating trees and livestock into one operation on the same land. So that would be an example here on the top right. Basically, this is a small conifer forest or like a pine forest where they're growing these trees to harvest the trees for lumber and to sell and make money at a sawmill, but they're also raising cattle underneath. So the cattle get protected from the sun, they get a little bit of shade, they've got grass to eat, and then they get 2 crops in one area. Another one would be agroforestry. This is basically deliberately incorporating the cultivation of food and the conservation of trees. So agroforestry is not super popular in the United States, but it is in developing countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Africa. The reason for that is primarily due to altered climatic conditions, so extreme weather conditions. Having trees around basically means you have higher water holding capacity and higher nutrient holding capacity. You're also providing getting natural shade. It's another crop that you can get. So incorporating trees improves the land overall, increases the number of crops you can harvest, and then basically manages the land in a more unique way. And agroforestry is commonly focused on the community level or community village level farm system rather than a global level farm system. And then lastly, permaculture. Permaculture is basically developing an agricultural ecosystem. So you basically say, this is my 10-acre farm, and I am going to try to put everything that this farm needs to survive and thrive and be self-sustaining on this 10 acres, and I'm going to try to do it with no external inputs. So permaculture is more like saying, this is my land forever. I'm going to try to grow all my food forever off of this piece of land. There are large permaculture farms, talking in the hundreds of acres, not the thousands of acres. But the majority of permaculture farms are probably going to lie under the 50-acre mark. There's a very popular permaculture farmer called Joel Salatin. So he does free range chicken tractors as well as daily rotated cattle and sheep. And you can look him up on YouTube. He's a very, very popular speaker, but he's an advocate for the permaculture style or a polyculture style farm. That is all I had for you guys today. If you had any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below or send me an email. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time, your energy, your effort, and I'll see you next time.